On November 6, 1894, the fourth largest city in the United States of America voted on whether to continue existing. The margin of the result, 277 votes out of more than 129,000 cast, was so thin that if 139 people had changed their minds on the walk to the ballot box, the entire history of New York City would be different. Brooklyn would still be Brooklyn, not a borough, not a neighborhood, not a place you describe in relation to Manhattan, a city. The city it had spent 2.5 centuries becoming, an industrial colossus with its own mayor, its own police force, its own navy yard, its own newspaper that was, at its peak, the most widely read afternoon paper in the country. All of it gone. Not because of a fire or a war or a financial collapse, because of a vote. A single, non-binding referendum that the losers could have fought, and nearly did, but in the end didn't fight hard enough. Here's what makes this story unlike any other American city story. Brooklyn didn't decline and then get absorbed. Brooklyn was absorbed, and then it declined. The vote came first. Everything else followed. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what Brooklyn was. And to understand what Brooklyn was, you have to start with the water. Brooklyn sits on the western tip of Long Island, separated from Manhattan by the East River, which isn't actually a river but a tidal strait roughly a quarter-mile wide at its narrowest, with currents fierce enough to drown strong swimmers. The Dutch founded a settlement called Breukelen here in 1646, named after a small town in the Netherlands. For nearly 2 centuries, the East River was Brooklyn's moat. You crossed it by ferry, and the crossing was slow, and that slowness made Brooklyn its own place. It was incorporated as a village in 1816 and as a city in 1834, and over the next several decades it grew with a velocity that startled even New Yorkers across the water. In 1850, the population was roughly 138,000. By 1880, it had reached nearly 600,000. By 1890, it was over 800,000. Brooklyn was not only growing, it was becoming in its own right one of the most important commercial and industrial centers on the continent. Early in the 19th century, Brooklyn Heights became what some historians call the world's first modern commuter suburb, its wealthy residents taking the ferry to Manhattan offices and returning each evening to homes with views of the harbor. But the rest of Brooklyn was no bedroom community. It was a maker of things, a builder, a city that manufactured and shipped and employed on a scale that most Americans today have entirely forgotten. Start with the waterfront. By the 1880s, Brooklyn's port was handling more tonnage than the port of Manhattan across the river. Ships from the Caribbean, from South America, from Europe, they docked along the East River shoreline in Williamsburg and Red Hook, and unloaded raw sugar, raw coffee, iron, timber, everything the Industrial Revolution ran on. Frederick Havemeyer, Jr. had moved his family's sugar refining operation from Manhattan to the Brooklyn waterfront in the years just before the Civil War, because Brooklyn offered what Manhattan couldn't: deep water, cheap land, and room to build. By 1870, that operation, later known by the Domino brand, was refining more than half of all the sugar consumed in the United States. Not half the sugar in New York, half the sugar in America. The Havemeyer family eventually organized the American Sugar Refining Company, which, through a series of acquisitions that would have made a Gilded Age railroad baron blush, came to control roughly 98% of the American sugar market. Their Brooklyn refinery was the largest plant in the operation, and at its peak in 1919, it employed 4,500 workers. At least a dozen smaller refineries lined the East River and Newtown Creek around it. Sugar wasn't the only industry. In Greenpoint, the Continental Iron Works built the USS Monitor, the Union ironclad that changed the course of the Civil War. In Bushwick, along a 14-block stretch that locals called Brewers Row, 14 breweries operated simultaneously in 1890, the German immigrant families who ran them producing lager for a thirsty city. In 1849, two German immigrants named Charles Pfizer and Charles Ehrhardt started a chemical company in a modest building in Williamsburg. That company was Pfizer. Down on the East River, the Brooklyn Navy Yard, established by the federal government in 1801 when it purchased 40 acres of waterfront for $40,000, had been building warships for the nation for the better part of a century and was already one of the largest employers in the region. By the mid-1800s, the yard had become Brooklyn's single biggest source of jobs. The surgeon E.R. Squibb, assigned to the yard's naval hospital, perfected the manufacture of anesthetic ether there in the 1850s, and then founded his own pharmaceutical company just outside the gates, a company that would supply the majority of medical supplies for the Union Army. Brooklyn didn't just manufacture goods, it manufactured an identity. They called it the City of Churches, not because it was especially pious, though it may have been, but because the churches were everywhere, their steeples defining the skyline the way skyscrapers would later define Manhattan's. Henry Ward Beecher, the most famous preacher in America, drew crowds to Plymouth Church in Brooklyn Heights every Sunday, and his sermons were reprinted in newspapers nationwide. The Brooklyn Academy of Music opened in 1861 and became one of the premier performing arts venues in the country. And in 1867, Prospect Park opened, 526 acres designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, the same partnership that had created Central Park in Manhattan, and Olmsted reportedly considered Prospect Park the superior work. Where Central Park was carved out of the existing city grid, hemmed in by buildings on all sides, Prospect Park had room to breathe, with meadows and woodlands and a 60-acre lake that froze in winter for skating. It was the kind of park a city builds when it believes in its own future. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle, founded on October 26, 1841, became the city's voice, and eventually the voice of an identity so fierce that it could not tolerate the idea of being secondary to Manhattan. Walt Whitman edited the paper from 1846 to 1848. By the 1880s, it was on its way to becoming the most widely read afternoon newspaper in the United States, its pages filled not only with local affairs, but with national and international reporting. The Eagle covered Brooklyn the way the Times of London covered Britain, as a matter of sovereign importance. And then there was the bridge. On May 24, 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge opened to the public after 14 years of construction, and 150,300 people crossed it on the first day alone. President Chester Arthur walked from the Manhattan side and shook hands with Brooklyn Mayor Seth Low at the Brooklyn Tower. Cannons fired, ships crowded the East River, fireworks lit the sky over both cities, because that's what they still were in 1883, two separate cities facing each other across the water. The bridge had cost $15.5 million, and Brooklyn had paid two-thirds of it. Brooklyn's bridge, built with Brooklyn's money, designed by John Roebling, a German immigrant civil engineer who died of tetanus after a ferry crushed his foot during initial survey work in 1869, 3 weeks before construction could begin. His son, Washington Roebling, took over and was crippled by decompression sickness from working in the underwater caissons. Washington's wife, Emily Warren Roebling, effectively ran the project for years, studying catenary curves and cable construction and dealing with the contractors. And on opening day, she was officially the first person to cross. 27 men died building it. When it was finished, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world, and people called it the 8th wonder of the world, and they were not entirely exaggerating. 6 days after the opening, a rumor that the bridge was about to collapse triggered a stampede on the pedestrian walkway. 12 people were crushed to death. The following year, P.T. Barnum marched 21 elephants across the span to prove it was safe. The bridge could bear any weight. What it could not carry, and what nobody thought to calculate, was the political weight of connecting two separate cities so completely that people began to wonder why they needed to be separate at all. The bridge was Brooklyn's crowning achievement. It was also, though nobody understood this yet, the instrument of Brooklyn's destruction. Because before the bridge, Brooklyn was separated from Manhattan by water, and that water was the source of Brooklyn's independence. You took a ferry. The ferry took time. You lived in Brooklyn, you worked in Brooklyn, you thought of yourself as a Brooklynite. Less than a week after the bridge opened, ferry operators reported a sharp drop in patronage, while the bridge's toll collectors were processing over 100 people per minute. The boundary was dissolving in real time. Within a few years, an estimated 1/3 of Brooklyn's working population was commuting across the bridge to jobs in Manhattan. Brooklyn was still a city, still had its own government, its own civic life, but the bridge had made it a commuter suburb in practice, even as it remained a sovereign city in law. And commuters, by their nature, begin to identify with the place where they work as much as the place where they sleep. This mattered because at the same time a man named Andrew Haswell Green was nursing an idea that most people in Brooklyn dismissed as a hobby, and which would turn out to be one of the most consequential political visions in American history. Green was a Manhattan lawyer, a civic planner of staggering ambition, and one of those figures who operates behind the surface of history but shapes it more than any mayor or governor. He had been instrumental in creating Central Park, had helped establish the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the American Museum of Natural History and the New York Public Library. He had widened Broadway and created the Circle at Columbus Circle. And for decades, starting as early as 1868, he had been pushing a single enormous idea: consolidate the cities and towns around New York Harbor, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, the Bronx, into one unified metropolis, one government, one tax base, one city powerful enough to rival London and to crush the upstart challenge of Chicago, which was growing so fast that it threatened to overtake New York as America's largest city. Brooklyn's elite called it Andy Green's hobby. They ran mocking advertisements in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, the city's paper of record, founded in 1841 and once edited by Walt Whitman. An ad that appeared repeatedly in October 1894 spelled it out. Brooklyn is a city of homes and churches. New York is a city of Tammany Hall and crime government. Rents are twice as cheap in Brooklyn as in New York, and homes are to be bought for a quarter of the money. The argument against consolidation was, on the merits, entirely reasonable. Brooklyn had lower taxes, cleaner politics, better schools, and a civic identity that its citizens had spent decades building. Why would you hand all of that to Manhattan? But Brooklyn had a problem, and the problem was water. The city's water supply was failing, infrastructure was aging, debt was mounting, and the cost of building a modern water system for a city of more than 800,000 people was more than Brooklyn's government could manage alone. The pro-consolidation forces understood this vulnerability and pressed it hard. Merge with New York, they argued, and Brooklyn gets access to the Croton Reservoir system, to Manhattan's engineering and bonding capacity, to a tax base large enough to build the sewers and bridges and waterworks that a modern city demands. Brooklyn real estate interests were told that property values would rise as space-starved Manhattanites flooded across the bridge in search of homes. Brooklyn's women, someone suggested, and this was actually used as a selling point, would be able to tell people abroad that they were from New York City, a name as prestigious as London or Paris. The opponents organized themselves into the Brooklyn League of Loyal Citizens, which claimed 50,000 members by 1895. They were led by old guard Protestant civic leaders and by St. Clair McKelway, the editor-in-chief of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, who turned the paper into a weapon against consolidation, publishing editorials, cartoons, essays, and even sponsoring anti-consolidation song contests. Their argument came down to a prophecy. Consolidation would mean Brooklyn's tax dollars flowing across the river to pay for Manhattan's problems, Brooklyn's identity smothered under Manhattan's weight. Brooklyn's clean government infected by Tammany Hall's corruption. Every one of those predictions, as it turned out, would come true. The referendum took place on November 6, 1894. It was non-binding, a question put to the voters, not a law. The results in Brooklyn were the closest of any district. 64,744 in favor, 64,467 against. 277 votes. In a city of more than 800,000 people, the question of whether to keep existing as an independent city was decided by a margin you could fit into a single church. The pro-consolidation forces declared victory. The anti-consolidation forces, shocked by how close they'd come to winning, organized furiously. Since the vote was non-binding, they knew the fight wasn't over. The Eagle ran more editorials. The League of Loyal Citizens pressed for a second binding referendum. For a while, it seemed possible that Brooklyn might survive. In 1895, the opposition managed to block further legislation in Albany. Andrew Haswell Green, for all his decades of effort, appeared to have been stopped. But the politics of the thing were bigger than Brooklyn. The question of consolidation was never really about Brooklyn's well-being. It was about power. And it was about Chicago. In 1880, Chicago's population had been 500,000. By 1890, it was over 1 million and growing faster than New York. The railroads had made Chicago the hub of the American interior, and the Midwestern metropolis was openly declaring its intention to surpass New York as the nation's premier city. Its businessmen were richer every year. Its slaughterhouses and mills were shipping goods worldwide. It had just hosted the World's Columbian Exposition, which drew 27 million visitors. If New York stayed confined to the island of Manhattan, the arithmetic was clear. Chicago would overtake it within a generation. The only way to prevent that was to make New York bigger, not by building more, but by absorbing the cities around it. And the biggest, richest, most important of those surrounding cities was Brooklyn. Thomas Platt, the Republican boss of New York State, saw consolidation as a way to dilute the power of Tammany Hall by folding Brooklyn's Republican voters into the city. Tammany's Democrats, paradoxically, also supported it. They saw a larger city as a larger patronage machine. The interests aligned. The state legislature passed the enabling legislation, and on April 30th, 1896, Governor Levi Morton signed it into law, over the objections of both the mayor of New York and the mayor of Brooklyn. A charter commission drew up the framework. The charter was signed into law in 1897. And on January 1st, 1898, the city of Greater New York came into being, a metropolis of more than 3 million people, the second largest city in the world, and the city of Brooklyn ceased to exist. Think about what disappeared that morning. Not a village, not a small town clinging to its independence out of sentiment. The fourth largest city in the United States of America. A city whose census population had reached over 800,000, and which, after absorbing the last remaining towns in Kings County in 1894 and 1895, was approaching 1 million. A city whose port moved more cargo than Manhattan's. A city that refined nearly all the sugar the nation consumed. A city that built warships for the U.S. Navy. A city with its own parks. Prospect Park, designed by Olmsted and Vaugh, the same team that created Central Park, and which many considered their finer work. A city with its own cultural institutions. The Brooklyn Academy of Music had been staging performances since 1861. A city with its own newspaper that rivaled any in the country. A city known as the City of Churches, where Henry Ward Beecher had preached to packed crowds at Plymouth Church, and where the architecture of faith was so dense and so ambitious that the skyline was defined by steeples, not smokestacks. All of that civic infrastructure, the mayor's office, the police department, the independent school system, the power to tax and spend and build according to the will of Brooklyn's own citizens, all of it surrendered. The building that had been Brooklyn City Hall was rechristened Borough Hall. The mayor became a borough president. The budget was now set across the river by people who answered to a larger constituency, one in which Brooklyn was, from that day forward, just one piece. The man who had made it all happen, Andrew Haswell Green, did not live long enough to see the full consequences. On November 13, 1903, 5 years after his vision was realized, Green was walking toward the front gate of his home at 91 Park Avenue in Manhattan when a man rushed at him and shot him 5 times. The killer, a man named Cornelius Williams, had apparently confused Green with someone else, a case of mistaken identity, bizarre and senseless. The father of Greater New York died on his doorstep at 83. Today, the only major memorial to him in all of New York City is a bench in Central Park. It was once surrounded by 5 elm trees, one for each borough. Almost immediately, the things Brooklyn's opponents had warned about began to happen. Tax dollars flowed toward Manhattan. Infrastructure decisions were made by city officials who prioritized Manhattan's needs. The Unified Board of Estimate gave each borough president a vote, but Manhattan's priorities dominated the agenda, and Manhattan's political machinery controlled the purse strings. Brooklyn's political clout, once wielded by its own mayor and city council, was now diluted into the apparatus of a government that treated it as an outer borough. The word itself was a wound, outer, as though Brooklyn, a city older than the nation, were somehow peripheral. The irony was that Brooklyn got its water. In 1917, the borough was connected to the Croton Reservoir system, securing a reliable supply for generations. The pro-consolidation forces had been right about the water. They had also been right that property values would rise and that Manhattan's population would overflow into Brooklyn's residential neighborhoods. What they had not mentioned, or perhaps had not foreseen, was that the price of that water was sovereignty, and that sovereignty, once surrendered, could not be bought back. The Brooklyn Navy Yard continued to operate, and during World War II, it became one of the most important industrial sites in the country. At its peak in late 1944, roughly 70,000 workers labored in 3 shifts around the clock, building and repairing the ships that fought the war in both oceans. The yard built the battleship Iowa in 1942 and the Missouri in 1944, the ship on whose deck in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, Japan would sign the instrument of surrender. During the war, the Navy Yard's workers, men and women, black and white, after the Fair Employment Practices Act of 1941 began opening skilled trades to African Americans for the first time, earned the yard the nickname the Can-Do Shipyard. It was, for those few years, the beating heart of Brooklyn's economy, a reminder of what the borough could produce when the nation needed it. But the Navy Yard's glory was a product of federal investment, not Brooklyn's own civic will. And when the defense contracts dried up, when Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara closed the yard in 1966, along with 90 other military installations, at a time when it still employed more than 9,000 workers and was the oldest continually active industrial plant in New York State, Brooklyn had no mayor to fight for it, no independent government to lobby Washington, no sovereign leverage at all. Just a borough president with limited power and a seat at a table where Manhattan's priorities came first. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle, the paper that had championed Brooklyn's independence and railed against consolidation for years, continued to publish after the city it served became a borough. It published continuously for 114 years without missing a single edition, a feat almost unmatched in American journalism. But by the mid-20th century, the economic base that had sustained it, an independent Brooklyn with its own civic life, its own advertising market, its own sense of self, was eroding. The paper's circulation had peaked when Brooklyn still thought of itself as a capital. As the borough's identity blurred into the larger city, as readers increasingly turned to Manhattan papers, the Eagle's audience thinned. The paper folded in January 1955, unable to survive a 47-day strike by the Newspaper Guild. At the time of its closure, it employed 681 people and did about $6 million a year in business. The Eagles' original headquarters at 28 Old Fulton Street still stands. It's a converted warehouse now, residential lofts. You can see it from the Brooklyn Bridge pedestrian walkway if you know where to look. The Eagles' demise came the same decade as the blow that many Brooklynites consider the cruelest of all. The Brooklyn Dodgers had played at Ebbets Field in Crown Heights since 1913, when the ballpark was built by owner Charles Ebbets on a patch of land that had previously been a garbage dump called Pigtown. The park was small, about 32,000 seats, and intimate, with fans so close to the field that you could hear the players argue with the umpires. It had roughly 700 parking spaces, which was fine when the fans took the trolley. The name Dodgers itself came from the Brooklyn habit of dodging streetcars, but was a serious problem by the 1950s, when the automobile had reshaped American life. The Dodgers were not merely a baseball team. They were Brooklyn's answer to every slight from Manhattan, every suggestion that Brooklyn was second-rate, every boardroom decision made across the river without Brooklyn's consent. In 1947, Jackie Robinson had taken the field for the Dodgers and broken baseball's color line, an act of moral courage that happened in Brooklyn, not Manhattan, and Brooklynites never let anyone forget it. The team won 6 National League pennants between 1947 and 1956, and in 1955, the World Series, the only championship in franchise history, the one they'd waited since 1890 to win. Walter O'Malley, who had gained majority ownership of the team in 1950, understood that Ebbets Field's limitations would eventually strangle the franchise. He wanted a new stadium. He had the money to build it. What he needed was land, and he had a specific site in mind, the intersection of Atlantic and Flatbush Avenues near the Long Island Railroad Terminal, accessible by subway and commuter rail, right in the heart of Brooklyn. He even commissioned Buckminster Fuller to design a futuristic domed stadium for the site, a structure that would have been unlike anything in baseball, seating 55,000 people with ample parking, a cathedral of sport built for a borough that had always believed it deserved one. What O'Malley did not have was the power to acquire that land on his own. And this is where the ghost of the 1894 vote reaches across 60 years to deliver its final consequence. In an independent Brooklyn, O'Malley would have dealt with Brooklyn's mayor. He would have dealt with a city government whose sole purpose was to serve Brooklyn's interests, a government for which keeping the Dodgers would have been an existential priority. But Brooklyn did not have its own mayor. Brooklyn had Robert Moses. Moses was New York City's Parks Commissioner and the head of the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, an unelected figure whose control over public works gave him more power than most elected officials in the state. Moses did not want a stadium at Atlantic and Flatbush. He wanted O'Malley in Flushing Meadows, Queens, a site Moses was developing on land Moses controlled for purposes that served Moses's vision for the city. O'Malley said no. The Dodgers were Brooklyn's team. Moving them to Queens, he said, would be no different from moving them across the country. As O'Malley himself put it, if I'm going to be outside Brooklyn, I could be 30 miles outside of Brooklyn, or I could be 3,000 miles outside of Brooklyn, and it's not going to matter. The negotiations dragged on for nearly a decade. Moses would not budge. Brooklyn Borough President John Cashmore, O'Malley's nominal ally, lacked the authority to overrule Moses or to condemn and acquire the land independently. In August 1957, Moses wrote a memo declaring the Atlantic Avenue site dead. O'Malley had already been talking to Los Angeles. On the back of an old envelope at a dinner earlier that year, O'Malley had scribbled a note to Philip Wrigley, the chewing gum magnate who owned the minor league Los Angeles Angels. "How much will you take for the Los Angeles Angels and Wrigley Field?" Wrigley wrote back, $2 million for the real estate and ballpark and $1 million for the franchise. O'Malley wrote, "Deal," and underlined it. No lawyers, no contracts, just 2 words on a scrap of paper, and Brooklyn's fate was sealed again. The Dodgers played their last game at Ebbets Field on September 24, 1957. The announced attendance was 6,702, a mostly empty stadium watching the end of something that had defined the borough for nearly half a century. Organist Gladys Gooding played Old Lang Syne as the players walked off the field for the last time. The team had won 6 National League pennants in the previous 10 years and the 1955 World Series, the only championship in franchise history. In the 1950s alone, the Dodgers had accounted for 44% of the entire National League's profits. It was not a failing franchise. It was a profitable franchise trapped in a political system that could not serve it. On May 28, 1957, the National League had voted to allow the Dodgers and the Giants to move to California, provided they went together. By the end of the year, both teams were gone. Brooklyn, once a city powerful enough to build the longest bridge in the world, could not hold on to a baseball team. A Brooklyn joke from the era. If you were in a room with Hitler, Stalin, and O'Malley, and you had only 2 bullets, who would you shoot? O'Malley, twice. The joke was funny because the anger was real, but the anger was misplaced. O'Malley had wanted to stay. He had spent a decade trying to stay. The problem was not O'Malley. The problem was that Brooklyn no longer had the political machinery to make its own decisions about its own land. That machinery had been surrendered on January 1st, 1898, the morning a city became a borough. Ebbets Field was demolished in 1960. A wrecking ball painted to look like a baseball smashed through the rotunda entrance while a small crowd watched. Some of them wept. The site became the Ebbets Field Houses, a public housing project. Today, if you stand at the corner of McKeever Place and Montgomery Street in Crown Heights, there is nothing to tell you that a ballpark was ever there, except a modest marker and the echo of a name on the apartment complex. The Domino Sugar Refinery on the Williamsburg waterfront, the Havemeyer's great monument to Brooklyn's industrial supremacy, continued to operate until 2004, refining sugar for more than a century after the city that had made it possible ceased to exist. It has since been redeveloped into luxury residential towers and office space, where one-bedroom apartments rent for sums that Frederick Havemeyer, Jr. once paid for entire city blocks of waterfront property. The sign that once spelled Domino in neon above the East River is a relic, repositioned as public art in a waterfront park. Borough Hall still stands at the intersection of Girolamo Street, Court Street, and Fulton Street in downtown Brooklyn. It was completed in 1849, a Greek revival building with Ionic columns and a copper cupola, built to be the seat of government for a great American city. It is a handsome building. It is also, if you know its history, one of the saddest buildings in America. It was designed as a city hall. It became a borough hall. The demotion is carved into the stone by absence, the absence of the authority it was built to house. The Brooklyn Bridge, the structure that opened this story, still carries roughly 150,000 people across the East River every day. A few years ago, workers finished the largest rehabilitation project in the bridge's history, removing a century of soot from the granite towers and revealing the stone's original bright gray color, the color it was on that May afternoon in 1883, when the President of the United States walked across it and the mayor of Brooklyn shook his hand at the other end, and cannons fired, and the city that had paid 2/3 of the cost of the greatest engineering achievement of the 19th century celebrated what it believed was its finest hour. Brooklyn had built a bridge to its neighbor. It did not know it had built a bridge to its own disappearance. The bonds that financed the Brooklyn Bridge were not fully paid off until 1956, 1 year after the Eagle folded, 1 year before the Dodgers left. If you walk across the bridge today from the Manhattan side, at about the midpoint you cross an invisible line. You are now in Brooklyn. There is no gate, no marker, no sign that says you have entered what was once a sovereign city. The pedestrian walkway is planked in wood, and the cables hum in the wind, and the view of the harbor is still extraordinary. The same harbor that Frederick Havemeyer looked at when he decided to build his refinery here. The same harbor that Andrew Haswell Green wanted to unite under one government. the same harbor that 70,000 workers looked out at from the Navy Yard during the war. If you stop on the Brooklyn side and look back, you can see Manhattan's skyline, the buildings that belong to the city that swallowed the city you're standing in. The towers are enormous, and they are beautiful, and they are over there. Brooklyn's skyline was always steeples. The steeples are still there, though you have to look for them now, behind the condominiums. 277 votes. You could fill a single subway car with the margin that ended one of the most remarkable cities America ever produced. Brooklyn's citizens were told that consolidation would bring lower taxes, better water, and a seat at the table of the greatest city on earth. They got the water, the taxes went up, and the seat at the table turned out to be at the far end, where you can see the meal being served, but you can't quite reach it. The people who voted against it called the consolidation the great mistake of 1898. Some Brooklynites still call it that. In 1993, Staten Island, the borough that had voted 4-1 in favor of joining Greater New York, held its own non-binding referendum on seceding from the city. 65% voted to leave. The state legislature blocked it. The door that Brooklyn had walked through turned out to lock from the outside. Brooklyn today has 2.7 million residents. If it were still an independent city, it would be the fourth largest city in the United States, behind the rest of New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. It would have its own mayor, its own budget, its own schools, its own police, its own power to decide where a stadium gets built and whether a team stays or goes. It would be, by any measure, one of the most important cities in the Western Hemisphere. Instead, it is a borough, a wonderful, resilient, culturally extraordinary borough, but a borough. The word itself tells the story. Borough comes from an Old English word meaning a fortified town. Brooklyn is no longer fortified. Its walls came down in 1898, voluntarily, by a margin of 277 votes, and nobody has been able to put them back up since. The last mayor of the independent city of Brooklyn was Frederick Worcester. He served until the city he governed became a borough on New Year's Day, 1898. There is, as far as the historical record shows, no major street, park, building, or monument in Brooklyn named after him. The last leader of a great American city, and the city he led, forgot his name. The bridge, on the other hand, the bridge that connected Brooklyn to the thing that consumed it, is the most famous bridge in the world.